Hello everybody, and welcome to the third episode of Understanding Happiness, Science and the Buddha. This is a podcast which aims to understand the topic of happiness using the two approaches of science and the humanities. And what we're trying to do is look at the most up-to-date scientific research and the most modern scientific fields and movements around happiness, and we're combining that with the accumulated wisdoms of thousands of years of human thought, and we're applying the scientific method to that human thought to see what's valid and what should be integrated into our worldview on happiness and what can be discarded. And when we talk about understanding happiness, it's not just talking about how to achieve happiness, it's going in a little bit deeper. It's about how do we understand the mind, which is the backdrop in which happiness is experienced. Where does happiness come from? What's the origin of it? What are the different types of it? What, in a scientific sense, is happiness? How do we achieve it, of course? And then also, how do we achieve meaning? And along the way, we're taking these subjects and we're looking at them through a scientific approach, but we're also utilizing the humanities. And I've chosen the Buddha for this title because I think Buddhism is one of the philosophical strains which is especially relevant for happiness, but also because I just feel like it really encapsulates this philosophical approach in quite a nice way. Now, this episode is called The Anatomy of Joy, and it's sort of looking at the scientific field of positive psychology, which is about how humans can acquire happiness and how we can understand happiness. And it's also looking at other scientific concepts to do with happiness, for example, the PERMA model, salutogenic theory, and how they overlap. Now, the first episode of this podcast was about conceptualizing the mind and the human psyche and using science and philosophy to come up with a good model of the human psyche which we can understand. The second episode was about using the lens of evolutionary psychology to see how happiness has evolved, and also why is it that sociality, morality, and self-transcendence are so important to happiness. This episode is really about what is happiness, how can we understand it, what are the different kinds of it, how is it being studied at the moment. The next episode is how to achieve happiness, and the fifth episode, finally, is all about meaning in life. Where does it come from? What can we do to acquire it? Now, this episode is about the scientific study of happiness. So let's get into it. I encourage the reader to do their own research in the scientific study of happiness, particularly because there's been a recent renaissance in the study of happiness in the form of the movement of positive psychology. Let's just take a moment to understand what positive psychology is. So in 1998, the new president of the American Psychiatric Association, Martin E.P. Seligman, said he wanted to change the focus of the way we practice psychology and understand psychology in the Western world. He argued that before World War II, the field of psychology had three main objectives. The first one was to cure mental illness and deal with psychopathology. Psycho being the prefix for mind, pathology just meaning any kind of disease or condition or some kind of deviation from health. The second objective was of American psychology, or Western psychology by extension before World War II, was to make relatively untroubled people, i.e. people without psychopathology, happier. And the third objective was to study genius and high talent and how to nurture it. And Seligman believed that all but the first two had kind of fallen by the wayside since after World War II. After World War II, the main focus of Western psychology became about pathogenesis, i.e. how disease and pathology is generated in the mind and how that can be remedied. But the problem is that had come at the expense of adequate focus on understanding how the human mind, the relatively untroubled human mind, can be made happier. How is it that the human mind and mental health can flourish and reach its full potential? The idea of positive psychology, the modern movement, the modern academic field of positive psychology dates from 1998, but it really represents a renaissance because the idea of understanding how is it that subjective experience can be made positive, how is it that we can enrich the life of the average person rather than alleviate the misery of someone with psychopathology, that idea has been pursued by various thinkers between World War II, or the onset of World War II, and the present day, notably Maslow, who you may have heard of in the term Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and other thinkers such as Ryff. But it is true that with positive philosophy, there has been a kind of large, newer surge of interest in this method of thinking, in understanding how is it that we can study happiness and break down happiness and think, how can we apply that to the average person? How can we make the average person happier? Now, in terms of positive psychology, not in terms of positive psychology, the aim of positive psychology, well, not the aim of positive psychology, but a lot of the intellectual wellspring from which the modern scientific research and theory of positive psychology draws from, is actually concepts from philosophical traditions. For example, the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, which we've mentioned before, also Buddhism, and also, in newer forms of positive psychology, Chinese philosophy and the concept of yin and yang, and also Taoism. Which is really, really interesting, because the aim of this podcast in general is to try and integrate the science and humanities, but this isn't an effort which I'm undertaking alone. Positive psychology is ultimately a scientific field and presents its findings in a scientific way. It's not overtly based on the synthesis of science and the humanities in the way this podcast is, but it still draws from or takes some kind of inspiration from philosophical ideas, as well as the ideas of thinkers like Maslow and Carol Ryff from the 20th century before the onset of modern positive psychology. And positive psychology is this kind of empirical study of the conditions and the processes that contribute to good mental health and happiness. Now, happiness, as I kind of briefly mentioned in the first episode, is a transient emotional state. Happiness is an emotion. When we are having a great time with some friends, when we're in a concert, when we're going for a lovely walk or reading a great book, we may feel happy. But that is happiness as a transient emotion, not as a general state, not as a general mental state. So the term used to describe happiness in the way that we mean it, or the way that is meant for the sake of this podcast, is a term called subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is this kind of long-term general state of mental health. It's this general conception of how happy are you? How well are you actually doing? Now, the idea of subjective well-being can be broken down into three constituent parts: hedonic well-being, evaluative well-being, and eudaimonic well-being. Now, the idea of eudaimonic well-being is not to be confused with the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia. They share the same name because they have sort of similar meanings and implications, but they're not the same. Now, all of these, someone who has all three of these forms of well-being is someone who, in the words of Martin Seligman, is said to lead the good life. Pursuing hedonic well-being leads to the pleasant life. Pursuing evaluative well-being leads to the good life. I'm not sure if I said the good life or the full life earlier. I mean, a person who uses all three kinds of well-being as routes to happiness is someone who leads the full life. I'm sorry if I said the term good life by mistake. So the tendency to pursue happiness via evaluative well-being is the good life, and the tendency to pursue happiness via eudaimonic well-being is the meaningful life. Let's take a look at what these actually mean. Hedonic well-being refers to the actual emotions that a person feels on an everyday basis. Someone with hedonic well-being is someone whose general overall balance of emotions is positive, i.e., is your life mostly filled with feelings of happiness, or contentment, or calm, or interest, or curiosity, or zest, or humor, or motivation, or is it primarily filled with negative feelings like anger, or envy, or sadness, or fear, or anxiety, etc., etc.? And it's all about how we're actually feeling, the emotions that we actually kind of experience on a daily basis. It can also be conceptualized as pleasure, in a sense, in that pleasure is fundamentally a physical sensation of how we feel. When we eat food, when we experience an orgasm, for example, when we're warm and we're comfortable, we experience pleasure. And this is a positive emotional state and is therefore included in the idea of hedonic well-being. And we can improve our hedonic well-being. It's kind of like hedonic well-being can also kind of be conceptualized as how we feel about the present that we're living in. Do we feel as if the life that we're living on an everyday basis is generally good or generally bad? And when people tend to talk about happiness in a colloquial sense, a lot of their time they're talking about hedonic well-being. And we can improve our hedonic well-being by various means, which we're going to be exploring later in this podcast, but that's kind of generally what it means so far, that hedonic well-being. We also have this idea of evaluative well-being, which can be conceptualized as life satisfaction. How pleased are we in general in what we're doing in life? Now, the key thing to understand about evaluative well-being is that it's about the pursuit not of pleasures and positive emotions, but gratifications. And gratifications are activities that engage us fully. They absorb us. And we may find gratification in Fixing a bike, learning a new skill, teaching a child, playing a guitar, or learning a new instrument, accomplishing some kind of difficult task, climbing a mountain. It's not the same thing as pleasure. We can gain shortcuts to pleasure, or ways of acquiring short-term pleasure, a myriad. Eating an ice cream, engaging in masturbation, having a massage, using drugs, but there's no shortcut to achieving gratifications. The idea of gratification is that they involve this kind of emotional state called a flow state. More on that later, but it's basically a kind of mental phenomenon in which you're absorbed entirely in the task that you're doing, and that this is inherently good. And also the pursuit of gratifications requires us to draw on character strengths. More on that later, but examples could be perseverance, motivation, resilience, sense of humor, creativity, appreciation of beauty, wisdom, intelligence, etc., etc. Now, gratifications are activities that may be enjoyable, but it's not really the same thing as positive emotion per se. So we may learn how to fix a bike, for example, and we may say afterwards that the process of doing so was fun, but while we're actually engaged in that process, as long as it's something that engages us fully, it's more that we're undistracted by thought or emotion. It's more that we're kind of absorbed in that event. Another example that I think better illustrates this point is something like training for a marathon. Training for a marathon and competing a marathon can be intensely gratifying and can increase our kind of overall life satisfaction when we look back at our life. I.e., when we look at the kind of past about our life. It's kind of like evaluative well-being. It's kind of like how we feel about the past. And we might feel really good about having trained for and run a marathon looking back on it. But at the time, it can be quite a grueling or dysphoric process. Now, the idea of gratification and flow and life satisfaction and living a life which you generally perceive as good is not the same as a life that you perceive as pleasurable, but it's still quite an important component of happiness. It's also, by the way, it's not as if any form of well-being is more important than another. They all work together in harmony. Now, a third root of happiness, eudaimonic well-being, is all about finding meaning and engagement in life. It's about deploying our strengths and using them in the service of something larger than ourselves. It's about what Maslow may describe, what you may have heard as self-actualization, i.e. becoming all that you can be, realizing your full potential, cultivating yourself, and by that process of cultivating yourself, changing yourself to become a more well-rounded individual who works on and cultivates their own character strengths while also developing new strengths. And fundamentally, eudaimonic well-being is about finding meaning in life somehow. And often religion and spirituality can be a source of meaning, but it doesn't need to be this. It can be something like knowledge or virtue or family or community or politics or some kind of society or association. Anything that we can kind of dedicate our lives in service to and which gives us a sense of anchoring. Our work, for example, can be an example of a source of eudaimonic well-being. Doing something that you really enjoy and which you feel has a real purpose can be a big source of meaning. For me, for example, doing this kind of project is a source of eudaimonic well-being. And the idea is that it satisfies a longing for purpose in life. And also, when we think about our future, if we have eudaimonic well-being, we conceptualize our future and indeed our life's trajectory as being meaningful in some way. Now, positive psychology seems to both conceptualizes what causes these different forms of well-being, what are the effects of these different causes of well-being, and how can we achieve these different forms of well-being? The latter of which can be achieved with what you may see referred to in studies as positive psychology interventions. For example, stuff that positive psychology researchers do or that they get people to do in order to increase their form of well-being. An example of this would be some form of gratitude journaling, where an example of a positive psychology intervention was when a patient, or rather a subject of the intervention, as we could say, would every day write down 3 things that they're grateful for, or 3 things that good that happened that day, and why they happened. And indeed, studies doing that have shown that people doing that over a long period of time do experience boosts in their happiness. Now, if you want to find some more examples of positive psychology interventions, and I really recommend you do because they are indeed a way of achieving well-being, what's a really good way to access the bulk of this scientific information is to type in your Google search bar, a website called PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D. And that's just a massive database of scientific papers. And you just click on the search bar in PubMed, type in positive psychology, and you get a wealth of current research. There's filters on the left-hand side of the page once you do look something up, click the box that says free full text. That basically means that you'll only see papers which you don't have to pay for in order to read in full, and you have access to this full bulk of research on positive psychology and how it can be achieved. And how the different forms of happiness can be achieved. Now, another important aspect in positive psychology, and remember, with positive psychology, even though Martin Seligman is one of the dominant thinkers behind it and the kind of initiator of this modern renaissance, there's lots of different thinkers involved, lots of different theories involved. It's not necessarily a solid, monolithic body of universal consensus. It's this very dynamic, changing, adaptive field with lots of different thinkers all contributing. Now, another concept, that's just something I wanted to get out of the way to establish. Another concept in positive psychology is the idea of mental health being a continuum. You see, in Western medical thought, we often tend to see health and disease as this kind of dichotomy, this dualist dichotomy, health, disease, being healthy, being unhealthy. When in reality, the human body and the human mind aren't really like that. We go through intermediate stages. Health, both bodily and mental health, should really be conceptualized as a continuum, not a dichotomy, wherein we vary on a vertical scale from stages of, for example, total presence of health to total absence of health. Now, on this mental health continuum, as it's called in positive psychology parlance, flourishing is the state of being at a high level of this continuum. It's a state of achieving those three different aforementioned kinds of well-being, and therefore being at a state of good mental health. Flourishing is a form of being happy, both in the moment, being happy with your general life satisfaction, and having a sense of meaning. And the idea of flourishing encompasses lots of different aspects of happiness. For example, as we mentioned, and it kind of integrates lots of previous theories on happiness. For example, as we mentioned, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you may have heard of, self-actualization is at the top of that hierarchy. And indeed, the actualizing of the self is seen as an important condition for flourishing. But flourishing is just the word used. The term was actually coined by a positive psychologist called Corey Keyes. That's Keyes. Flourishing is just that state of being high up on that mental health continuum. It's a state essentially of having good mental health, to use the common meaning of happiness, of being happy, even though in reality we would say of having a high level of subjective well-being. Now, the opposite to that is this state of languishing. Languishing, another term coined by Corey Keyes, and it refers to being a low stage on that mental health continuum. And it's when you don't actually have a form of psychopathology. You don't actually have, say, depression or anxiety or anything like that, but you're not happy. You may feel as if the general experience of your life is not a happy one. You're not experiencing a good balance of positive and negative emotions. Your life doesn't have meaning. You're not engaged with your life. You're not actualizing yourself and realizing your full potential. You're not in a state of self-transcendence. You don't look back on your life with satisfaction and reflection on your achievements. You're not developing your character strengths in a good way. You're not experiencing a lot of flow or peak experiences, as we talked about in the last episode of this podcast. You are essentially someone who's not experiencing any kind of mental disorder, but you're just not happy. You're not experiencing the flourishing that is seen at the high levels of the mental health continuum, where all of these concepts, all these different forms of well-being are indeed united in this general state of mental health. And indeed, there are intermediate states between the idea of flourishing and languishing. And indeed, flourishing and languishing are themselves umbrella terms, overlapping a range of levels on that mental health continuum. But there's also lots of moderate levels between that. And of course, once you go, there's also a level below that of languishing, where you're in such a state of abject misery that you can be said to be having a depressive episode. I.e., we get to the point at lower down levels on that mental health continuum where you can be said to be experiencing a form of pathology. And this actually is a much, much better way of conceptualizing health and the presence of pathology, because in reality, stuff like anxiety or depression, all human beings have the capacity to feel anxious or to feel sad. These are basic emotional states. All human beings will, for example, experience different levels or different frequencies and different intensities of these emotional states of depression and anxiety. And indeed, if we take a trait like anxiety, a trait like the propensity to feel anxious and the intensity with which that anxiousness is felt, we can take a spectrum and we can order all individuals in the world at some place along that spectrum, right? That is a standard part of the human experience, of the human condition. And a lot of the time, people may experience greater than average levels of anxiety and greater than average severity of anxiety, but they may still do so at a subclinical level. What does that mean? It means that maybe their experience of anxiety is more than that which is part and parcel of the human experience, but it doesn't quite reach the levels to be defined as a form of pathology, i.e. to meet that kind of grade in the spectrum, that line that we draw in that spectrum where we say, this is a form of disease, this is a form of mental illness. Now, of course, the place where we actually draw that line is arbitrary to an extent. In fact, it necessitates the inability of drawing a specific line. Often with physical conditions, we can draw a line by saying, yes, you are said to be experiencing a fever if your temperature exceeds X.YZ Celsius. Or we can be said to be experiencing a form of steroid responsive COPD if the concentration of eosinophils in your blood exceeds X%. With mental health, it's much more subjective, it's much more vague, it's much more ill-defined. But the point that I'm trying to make is that necessarily the only valid way to conceptualize mental health, or even physical health, but to a large extent mental health, even outside the idea of positive psychology, is as this kind of continuum. And the example that I've used is anxiety, but it applies to all kinds of traits. I mean, depressiveness is one, for example. Apathy is another. Loss of motivation is another. All of these kinds of things. Now, a model. So the question is, how does positive psychology say that we achieve the idea of flourishing? And we're going to be talking more about how flourishing can be achieved in the next episode. But a model which has been pioneered by Martin Seligman as this way of achieving flourishing it was kind of forwarded by Martin Seligman in this book that he wrote in 2011 called Flourish, which can kind of be summarized by the mnemonic PERMA. PERMA stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning and purpose, and accomplishments. Let's look at all of this. Let's kind of break this down. So subjective well-being is kind of conceptualized as the product of this model, PERMA, the product of these 5 things. And the PERMA model, while forwarded by Seligman, has now become integrated as a core part of positive psychology and has seen lots of modifications. There are lots of different kind of PERMA variants, such as PERMA plus models that you'll find if you look up the phrase PERMA model online. But let's just break down what this model is. So the P stands for positive emotions. And that is including, basically, how are you feeling? And this includes a wide range of feelings. It's not just happiness. It's not just a transient emotion that is happiness. It's other positive emotions such as excitement, satisfaction, pride, awe, wonder, interest, love, social harmony, tolerance, trust. All of these emotions are connected to positive outcomes. And we talked about how in episode 1, positive emotions are really, really strongly connected to the functions of the body, using mechanisms such as the nervous system, the hormonal system, the immune system, etc. Now, the E stands for engagement, and it refers to this involvement in activities that not just utilize one's interest and draw upon one's interest, but also builds one's interest. Now, another important positive psychologist is an individual called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. That is a difficult word to pronounce. I believe he is a Czech person. I believe he is Czech. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly. It's quite a long name, but Csikszentmihalyi described true engagement as this state of being in flow. More on that later. But it's this kind of state of deep, effortless involvement and absorption in whatever activity you're doing in a way that even if we may not be feeling deeply positive in the moment, is still inherently deeply satisfying. And it leads to a sense of joy and also clarity. The idea is that engagement involves passion for and concentration on the task at hand, and it's all about building on our interests and building on our skills, both utilizing them and improving them. Now, the R in the PERMA model stands for relationships. But human beings are social animals, which we talked about in episode 2, and relationships are essential in fueling positive emotions. And these positive emotions can be these relationships can be familial, they can be platonic, they can be friendly, they can be work-related, they can even be with complete strangers. They can be fleeting interactions with strangers that we find positive. They can, of course, be romantic as well. As one of the most important positive psychologists, Christian Peterson, puts it, other people matter. Relationships can be a big source of both receiving, sharing, and also giving positivity to others. They're very important both in bad times and good times. And there's a wealth of social studies showing that happiness is correlated not just to the number of relationships, but more importantly to the depths of relationships. It's better to have a small number of deep, meaningful, close relationships and real solidarity than lots of superficial ones. Now, the M in the PERMA model stands for meaning. It's also known as purpose, and it's basically what do you do that gives you a sense of purpose? What thing larger than yourself, larger than the gratification of your own immediate needs, does someone have in their life to bring them a source of joy? And finally, the A stands for accomplishments, and it's all about the pursuit of success and mastery in things. Now, accomplishments don't always result in positive emotions, meaning, or relationships. In fact, a lot of the time, the drive for accomplishment, when pushed too far, can actually hinder positive emotions, positive relationships, a source of meaning, and a source of engagement with things. The point is rather that accomplishments, when done in the right context and pursued with the right intensity, can be a big source of positive emotion and also better ways of thinking about the self. Accomplishments are really important in building up the idea of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is basically the idea that you can do the things that you set your mind to. And it's really important, as you can imagine, in not just people's sense of self, but also their overall happiness and their mood. Now, Seligman selected each of the elements of PERMA according to 3 criteria. Firstly, it's measured and defined independently of all these other elements. It also contributes to subjective well-being in some way, and also it's pursued for its own sake in some way. Now, the PERMA model as the basis of flourishing is related to, but independent of, another model for conceptualizing well-being, which was forwarded in 1989 by the positive psychologist Ryff. And I say positive psychologist because she obviously was defining her theories at a time where positive psychology as a movement didn't really exist at that point, but she is still now, and in the kind of general purpose and orientation of her research, can still be characterized as a positive psychologist. And Ryff proposed this 6-factor model of psychological well-being. It's this theory, which basically says that 6 factors contribute to subjective well-being. And these 6 factors are autonomy, i.e. the idea that a person is independent and is able to regulate his or her behavior independent of external compulsion or social pressures. So, for example, a high score on this field of autonomy is self-determining. They're independent. They evaluate themselves by their own standards. They regulate behavior from within. They hold themselves to intrinsic standards of behavior and regulate that themselves, rather than being subjected to some extrinsic force of behavior. They're able to resist social pressures to think and act in certain ways, and they're able to broadly determine the trajectory of their own life. A low scorer in this dimension of autonomy, and by the way, there are various measurement scales for measuring the 6-factor model of social well-being. Ryff does have a scale for this, the Ryff scale of measurement, which is this kind of psychometric inventory. And it is, in fact, it's not just based on being happy, but it's based on the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, which we've mentioned before, and I'm just going to bring up again. The Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia is forwarded in one of his works called Nicomachean Ethics. And it's basically where the goal of life isn't feeling good, but it's instead about living virtuously. Now, the Aristotelian, and indeed the Greco-Roman conception of virtue, is different from our modern conception of virtue. Our modern conception of what virtue means is largely based on the Christian tradition of moral values, for example. For example, like the 7 deadly sins, the opposite of those would be 7 virtues. The Aristotelian conception of virtue would just be realizing the full potential of what a human being can be. It is applying the use of reason and perfectibility of the self and searching for meaning in life in order to reach what Maslow, for example, would call self-actualization. And eudaimonia, in the Aristotelian sense, is an important inspiration and basis for the idea of flourishing, although it is separate. The point is, eudaimonia is, in the Aristotelian sense, is said to be the aim of Ryff's 6-factor model of psychological well-being, rather than just physical pleasure or what we may conceive as hedonic well-being. Ryff's scale is all about the ultimate realization of the self, i.e. self-actualization, self-cultivation, self-transformation, and transcendence, which, as we've said numerous times in this podcast, is supported both by the sciences and by various philosophies as this kind of ultimate stage of happiness, this ultimate cause of what happiness is. That was our digression. Let's return to the different aspects of this 6-factor model. So that first factor is autonomy. The second factor is environmental mastery. And what that basically means is making effective use of the opportunities in your life, being able to manage everyday affairs and create situations to benefit personal needs and to benefit your character strengths. So a high scorer in the field of environmental mastery has a sense of basic mastery and competence. They have this idea of self-confidence and self-efficacy. They find themselves able to control and regulate an array of external activities, make effective use and be able to pursue opportunities that surround them, and be able to choose or create contexts that suit their personal needs and values. I.e., for example, in episode 1, we said that in the rider-elephant model of the mind, it was the goal of the rider to create a suitable environment in which the elephant may be appeased and find happiness. For example, developing good habits, surrounding yourself with good people, working on personal relationships, engaging in behaviors like meditation or CBT that benefit one's happiness. Environmental mastery is all about that. And a low score in environmental mastery is someone who may have difficulty managing everyday affairs, feel unable to change or improve their surrounding context, be unaware or unable to seize surrounding opportunities, and lacks a sense of control over their external world. The third aspect of the 6-factor model is personal growth. Someone who continues to develop over time, who welcomes new experiences, who broadens their sense of self and their character, and who recognizes and pursues an improvement in behavior and in themselves over time. So a high scorer would have a feeling of continued development. They would see themselves as growing or expanding. They would be open to new experiences. They would have a sense of realizing their potential, or at least trying to realize their potential, and is changing in ways that reflect an increase in self-knowledge or effectiveness. The opposite of this is someone with a sense of personal stagnation, who feels like they're not really going anywhere, they're not really changing as a person, they're not really building on themselves, who feels bored or uninterested in life or apathetic and feels unable to develop new attitudes, behaviors, or skills. The fourth factor is positive relations with others, i.e., do you engage in meaningful relationships with others that include a reciprocal exchange of empathy, intimacy, and affection. So a high scorer would have warm, satisfying, trusting relationships with others. They'd be concerned about the welfare of others. They would be concerned about what we may call morality, which, by the way, supports the assertion made in the previous episode that morality is important to happiness. They are capable of strong empathy. They are capable of affection and connection and intimacy, and they understand the give and take nature of human relationships. Someone who is low scoring on this factor may have few close trusting relationships. They may find it hard to be warm or open or even concerned about others. They may find themselves often isolated or socially excluded or rejected or feeling different in some kind, or just not willing to make compromises to sustain important ties with others. The fifth factor of this model is purpose in life. Do you have a strong goal orientation and a conviction that life holds meaning? Do you have a sense of directedness? Do you feel like there's a meaning to your present and your past? Do you hold beliefs that you have something to do, some form of meaning or way to engage in the world around you? Do you have aims or objectives? Or, in contrast, do you lack a sense of meaning? Do you lack goals or aim? Do you lack direction? Do you lack outlooks or beliefs that give your life some kind of meaning? Do you not see a purpose in the past that you've lived? The final factor here is self-acceptance. Do you possess a positive attitude towards you? Do you acknowledge and accept the multiple aspects of yourself, including the good and the bad qualities? Do you feel positive about your past life? Or do you indeed feel dissatisfied, disappointed with yourself, troubled about certain personal qualities? Do you wish to be different than what you are? These 6 factors are important in achieving happiness. And again, they all kind of align with the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, which is all about first knowing yourself and then being all that you can be. It's about discerning your unique talents and working to bring them to reality. And the idea of character strengths and virtues is actually quite important for positive psychology. In fact, Peterson and Seligman created this handbook called the Character Strengths and Virtues, or CSV handbook, to try and identify and classify positive psychological traits of human beings. And there is actually a quiz of the CSV which seeks to identify the virtues of the person doing the quiz, which I recommend that you do, the purpose of which being to nurture these traits and or at least try and work on them and be aware of them and to pursue activities and patterns of thought that benefit them, which, by the way, is very, very closely linked with the Buddhist concept of self-cultivation and knowing your own strengths and working on yourself. So, The Character Strengths and Virtues Handbook takes the basic view that virtues have a biological basis, that there is a biological basis for morality, and that therefore it rejects the philosophical position of moral relativism, which is that there is no objective basis in morality. I mentioned this before in last episode, but in the podcast which I normally run, Polymath, we do actually explore the innate nature of morality in episode 5. Now, the character strengths and virtues are organized in these 6 umbrella categories called virtues, and each of these has various different strengths. There are 6 virtues, and in total, 24 strengths. These are not evenly distributed. The first of the 6 virtues is wisdom and knowledge, and it contains the strengths of creativity, curiosity, open-mindedness, a love of learning, perspective, innovation, and prudence. The second virtue is courage, and it's constituted of the strengths of bravery, persistence, vitality, and zest. Vitality is the kind of capacity to grow and develop, and zest is just a sort of general enjoyment for life, treating life as an adventure, displaying enthusiasm, excitement, and energy as you deal with the tasks of life. The third character strength is humanity. The third character virtue is humanity, and it consists of the strengths of love, kindness, and social intelligence. Virtue number 4 is justice. It consists of the strengths of citizenship, fairness, leadership, integrity, and excellence. Excellence, by the way, corresponding to the Greek concept of eris, which we talked about in the last episode. Citizenship, generally having this kind of being an active citizen, being involved in your community, and being able to have some influence on the direction of the community that occurs. The 5th virtue is temperance. It consists of the strengths of forgiveness and mercy, humility, and self-control. And the 6th virtue is transcendence. And it consists of the strengths of appreciation of beauty, gratitude, hope, humor, and spirituality. And all of these character strengths and virtues are important not only in fully developing the self, as in the Aristotelian eudaimonic sense, but also in achieving happiness. Hence the constant emphasis on creativity and open-mindedness and love for learning and perspective and zest for life, but also in kindness, social intelligence, and love, which, as we've seen, is really important to developing strong relationships with people. Also in the idea of morality, which we've seen is really important to happiness. And finally in transcendence, which we've been talking about this whole time. Now, another key idea in positive psychology is the idea of being in flow state. Now, the idea of flow doesn't come from the 21st century with the onset of the positive psychology renaissance. It was actually developed in the 70s by the researcher, which I said, Csikszentmihalyi. And it's referred to as a kind of optimal experience. It's characterized by an intense concentration, a loss of self-awareness, a feeling of being perfectly challenged, neither bored or overwhelmed, and a sense that time is flying. It's when we get lost in the task that we're doing. And flow, the ability to access flow state and the frequency in which we do access flow state, is said to be quite important for happiness. Very important for happiness, rather, in positive psychology. And it kind of comprises the idea of evaluative well-being that we were talking about earlier. Being in flow state can also be seen, it's related to the Maslowian, I'm not sure if that's the correct adjective pertaining to Maslow, but Maslow's concept of peak experiences, which is this kind of transcendental experience where we feel ecstatic, this kind of rare, exciting, oceanic, deeply moving experience that changed the experiencer spiritually and develop a new perspective and way of conceptualizing and actualizing the self. And peak experiences, by the way, don't need to be religious in nature, although they often are. They can also be, as mentioned, a great appreciation of nature. The use of psychoactive substances in the form of an entheogen, which we talked about last episode, some kind of extreme sports activity, getting lost in a crowd or in a movement, or some kind of great kind of experience in childhood or adulthood with close friends and loved ones, especially, however, in the early developmental phases of life. Now, these are all very important parts of positive psychology, but there's been a new kind of development in positive psychology, also known as the second wave of positive psychology, or also known as experiential positive psychology. Now, this second wave of positive psychology was pioneered by this researcher called Wong, and is in fact largely associated with his ideas, although there are other important researchers working in second wave psychology. And second wave psychology is basically about saying how first wave psychology is often criticized because it just focuses on the achievement of happiness from a neutral state, rather than the alleviation of psychopathology in order to reach a neutral state. And in fact, this is the whole point of positive psychology. The whole point of positive psychology is to look at human flourishing rather than the alleviation of psychology. But then a criticism of that, which has been levied by lots of different quarters, is that by doing that, you're not really getting the full experience of mental health. You're not actually capturing the full human experience of that, because suffering and misery and occasionally psychopathology are indeed normal parts of the human condition. Now, second wave positive psychology seeks to kind of remedy that. And it's called existential positive psychology in some contexts because it merges the philosophy of existentialism with the scientific field of positive psychology. Now, the philosophy of existentialism is all about dealing with the purposes of existence and existential suffering. The idea in second wave positive psychology is that lots of human suffering can be classified as existential suffering, i.e. a lack of meaning or purpose in life, a lack of connection to others, thoughts about the process of dying, struggles around the state of being, difficulty in finding a sense of self and who you are, losing hope, losing autonomy. And this kind of suffering is in fact, both existential suffering and indeed suffering in general, is indeed part of life. This, by the way, is a Buddhist concept. Buddhism has 4 key postulates, which are known in Buddhism as the 4 noble truths. One of them is that dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, or suffering, is a normal part of life. Second wave positive psychology explicitly champions this as well. And this isn't a coincidence, by the way. Second wave positive psychology quite strongly draws not just on Buddhism, but especially on Chinese philosophy in the idea of yin and yang. And yin and yang, the idea of yin and yang is that these are 2 dialectical forces. They are these 2 complementary but antagonistic forces that oppose each other. And by integrating these forces, by synthesizing them together, we can find balance or a sense of rightness. Now, the idea of yin and yang is very important in Chinese philosophy, and the various different schools of Chinese philosophical thought, for such as Taoism. And the key thing that it's a dialectical mode of thinking. What is a dialectical mode of thinking? A dialectical mode of thinking is when we have an idea, we also have some kind of concept, we also have some kind of antithesis to that concept, some kind of opposite of that concept, and by combining the one and the other, by combining these 2 antagonistic ideas, we gain a synthesis. We gain a new whole. Now, the idea is that positive psychology is this synthesis between the idea that second wave positive psychology or existential positive psychology is this synthesis between existentialism and positive psychology. The idea of dialectical mode of thinking also has its echoes in Western philosophy as well. For example, the philosopher Hegel often talked about dialectics, and indeed the idea of Hegelian dialectics is named after him because he was so influential in the kind of Western study on dialectics. The idea in Hegelian dialectics is that you have an idea, you have a concept, a thesis. You have the opposite of that concept, an antithesis, and you then combine them to form a synthesis. I.e., you take these 2 contradictory concepts and you assimilate them into a new whole. And Hegelian dialectics is applicable to any form of ideas. It can be applicable to logic or mathematics or politics and economics. In fact, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did apply Hegelian dialectics to political economics in the form of dialectical materialism or historical materialism, which is a really important basis of Marxist theory. Naturally, the purpose of this podcast is not to talk about Marxism, although I am going to be doing a polymath episode on it at some point. The point is that this idea of dialectics, far from being conjured up by existential positive psychology, has this rich intellectual background in Western and Eastern philosophy. Now, positive psychology, the second wave positive psychology, or positive psychology 2.0, says that not only is suffering a part of life, but in fact suffering is necessary for flourishing, and also that enduring happiness and well-being can only be achieved by this dialectical integration of opposites, the dialectical synthesis of the thesis of suffering and the antithesis of joy. The metaphor of a piano keyboard is often used. Beautiful music is only produced by engaging both the black and the white keys. And the key thing is that suffering has a sense of intrinsic value. It makes us aware of our need to be connected with our spiritual side, or spiritual values such as compassion, humility, forgiveness, connecting with others. Indeed, self-transcendence is one of the main themes in the idea of suffering, because the idea is that suffering can produce a kind of search for meaning in something greater than ourselves, which can ultimately lead to the process of self-transcendence. And also suffering can induce us to pursue deep connections and to abandon pursuits like those for wealth or social status, which ultimately don't lead to long-lasting happiness. Suffering, by deepening our character strengths, by encouraging self-transcendence, by encouraging our drive for connecting with other people, and by broadening our capacity to cope, suffering can indeed increase our resilience. And by doing this, by increasing our resilience, suffering is kind of transformed in this way to flourishing. In fact, in positive psychology, there's this concept called the stealing effect. It's also known as stress inoculation or anti-fragility. And it notes that exposure to moderate psychological stresses can actually increase our capacity for dealing with stress and dealing with negative emotion, and therefore confers resilience to us, helping us deal with stresses later down the line. And the idea of moderate stresses helping to make us stronger, or the quote, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," doesn't just apply to mental health, it applies to physical health as well. Every time you lift weights in order to build muscle, what you're doing is putting your muscle under moderate amounts of stress to induce your body to make that muscle stronger, and therefore to increase the amount of stress that it can withstand. The immune system kind of works in a similar way. For example, it's said that in the Western world, the large increase in incidence of allergies and hypersensitivities is used. This is, by the way, a hypothesis called the hygiene hypothesis. It's been said that the large incidence of autoimmune conditions and allergies is due to the increased hygiene that Western households often subject developing children to. Because the idea is that without moderate stresses on the immune system early in life, it doesn't make itself stronger, and therefore is more likely to go wrong and be unable to deal with stress later. The idea in second wave psychology is that suffering kind of does a similar function. Suffering induces coping mechanisms focused on meaning, and also induces self-transcendence. It teaches us life intelligence. And the idea is that rather than positive psychology just focusing on happiness and how to achieve it, positive psychology should also be focused on how we deal with suffering and how we conceptualize suffering and integrate it into our worldview and happiness. I.e., whereas the study of psychopathology is the thesis and positive psychology, first wave positive psychology, is the antithesis, the synthesis is second wave positive psychology. There is in fact a third wave positive psychology, which focuses on broadening the applications and the conceptualizations of positive psychology away from the individual into lots of different disciplines. For example, applying positive psychology to education in a subfield known as positive education. It's about applying positive psychology to lots of different cultural contexts and cultural backgrounds and applying it to the community. And indeed, if you go online and you find, and this is a free handbook online by there, if you look up the handbook of salutogenesis, that isn't to do with salutogenesis as a separate concept of positive psychology, but it often talks about how positive psychology can be applied in this way. Also, if you look up the handbook of health promotion, you'll find lots of kind of elaborations of third wave positive psychology. That isn't the point of this podcast per se. This is about the individual and achieving happiness for the individual. But it is still a very important concept to talk about. Now, I've mentioned this thing called salutogenesis. Now, salutogenesis is this theory about conceptualizing health that came from this Israeli researcher, Aaron Antonovsky, in 1979. And it's sort of similar to the mental health continuum. See, salutogenesis or salutogenic theory basically posits that, again, we cannot dichotomize health and disease in our conceptualization of medicine. And yet this is exactly what Western medical theory tends towards, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. Instead, salutogenic theory conceptualizes health as a spectrum. And this spectrum is one of ease/dis-ease. That's dis-ease as in D-I-S-ease, encompassing both disease in the way that we see it, but also just a general lack of ease. And in this continuum, see, salutogenesis, the word salutogenesis, is focused on the generation of health. Salute is a Latin word for health, and genesis comes from the Greek word genestias, I believe, which means the beginning of, or something like that, or to begin. I talked about the specific etymology of the Greek word genesis in the last episode of this podcast, so forgive me if that's slightly inaccurate. but the information is there. Genesis essentially means the beginning of. And the idea of salutogenesis is specifically worded to be in juxtaposition to pathogenesis. You see, Aaron Antonovsky noticed that Western medical thought, both in the realms of physical health and mental health, didn't really focus on the generation and the optimization of health, but rather on how diseases, or rather pathology, comes about and how that can be managed. But Antonovsky believed that that wasn't sufficient. It's not enough just to alleviate disease and pathology. You have to work towards being actually healthy and achieving one's full potential and being in a state of positive, of genuine, total presence of health, both physical and mental. And in this kind of salutogenic spectrum, we have one end represented by H+, which represents the total presence of health, and the other end, H-, which represents the total absence of health. And each individual ranges somewhere along this spectrum at any given time. Now, a key part of salutogenic theory, much like second wave positive psychology, although salutogenic theory precedes second wave positive psychology by decades, is that stresses and hardships are a general part of life. They are unavoidable. Sometimes the term used to refer to these general everyday stresses are generalized resource deficits, or GRDs. But the terminology isn't important. The point is that stresses and hardships are a part of life. Now, an individual's capacity to deal with these stresses or stresses of life is known as their sense of coherence. Now, Antonovsky defined the sense of coherence as quoted, a global orientation that expresses the extent to which one has a pervasive, enduring, though dynamic feeling of confidence that 1. The stimuli from one's internal and external environments in the course of living are structured, predictable, and explicable. 2. The resources are available to one to meet the demands posed by these stimuli. And 3. These demands are challenges worthy of investment and engagement. That's quite an opaque technical definition. Let's break that down. A sense of coherence is just your own sense of being able to deal with, of being able to understand, deal with, and want to deal with these various stresses and hardships that are a part of everyday life. Your sense of coherence is just your individual ability it's your kind of view of life and your individual ability to respond to stressful situations. Now, there are 3 components to your sense of coherence in salutogenic theory. There's comprehensibility, manageability, and apologies, my screen just went black and timed out. The sense of coherence has 3 components. One of them is comprehensibility. This is the cognitive dimension, and it refers to the extent with which you perceive internal and external stimuli, i.e. sources of stress, coming from both within yourself, within your own mind, and coming from the external environment, these internal and external stimuli. Comprehensibility is the extent to which you perceive these stimuli as understandable, and as information which is orderly and clear, and stuff that you can actually explain and comprehend, and therefore go to some direction in dealing with it. Now, the ability to create structure out of chaos is a key part of this thing. A prerequisite to be able to cope with a stressful situation is to understand what that stressful situation is. If it's all just chaos to you, it's obviously going to be harder for you to deal with it. Now, the second component of the sense of coherence is manageability. This is the instrumental or behavioral dimension. It's defined as the degree to which you feel as if there are resources at your disposal that you can use to deal with these stresses. These resources we're going to get to in a bit. That's another key concept of salutogenic theory, which we're going to get to in a bit. The final dimension of sense of coherence is meaningfulness. This is the motivational dimension, and it refers to the extent that you feel like the problems in your life are even worth engaging with. It's your motivation to actually deal with the problems that face you. It's the extent to which one feels that your life has an emotional meaning, that at least some of the problems faced in life are worth commitment as dedication, and are seen as challenges rather than just burdens. The idea is that having a strong sense of coherence helps pushes you further along that ease/disease spectrum towards the H+ pole, i.e. that total presence of health. Now, what are these resources which I mentioned earlier? Resources are things which are kind of utilized to confront stresses, to confront the hardships that are evident in life, and which also contribute to the sense of coherence. And these resources can be generalized resistance resources and specific resistance resources. Now, generalized resistance resources, or GRRs, are just these kind of general assets that you have at your disposal as an individual to deal with the hardships of life. These can be physical, they can be social, they can be emotional. Antonovsky actually categorizes them as 7 categories. One of the categories of GRRs is physical and genetic, i.e. having a strong constitution, a strong physical form, a strong level of health, a strong immune system. The second category is material resources, such as money, a place to live, food. The third category is cognitive and emotional resources, knowledge, intelligence, good strategies for coping, emotional intelligence. The fourth category is ego identity, a positive perception of yourself, a high self-efficacy, a high self-confidence. The fifth category is valuative and attitudinal, i.e. coping strategies characterized by rationality, flexibility, and foresight. Also just a good outlook of life in general. The sixth category is interpersonal/relational, i.e. having connections with other people, having social support, so a social support network, having good relationships, having people that you can turn to. And the seventh category is macro social cultural aspects. This is cultural stuff, shared values in society. These are generalized resistance resources. The idea is that these, again, help push you forward in that ease-disease spectrum and help counteract the effects of generalized resistance deficits. And the balance between resistance resources and resistance deficits determines where you lay on that spectrum. Now, specific resistance resources they're also assets, but they're specific to a situation. So, for example, intelligence is a generalized resistance resource. Your intelligence on how to cope with a specific situation, i.e. if your car breaks down, your ability to fix up your car is a specific resistance resource. Now, salutogenic theory is independent of positive psychology, and indeed positive psychology emerged independently of it. But salutogenic theory is becoming increasingly integrated with positive psychology, and lots of positive psychologists are not only familiar with this theory, but operate according to its conceptualizations and postulates. The literature review which I'm doing on the subject of happiness, which by the way is included as an appendix in the Spotify bio, is fundamentally about the integration of positive psychology and salutogenic theory. It's about the application of salutogenic theory using the lens of positive psychology. And it's my opinion that in order to best understand happiness, positive psychology necessarily has to integrate salutogenic theory and things like second wave positive psychology, etc., etc. Although the basic postulates of positive psychology kind of do so by effect anyway. Like you may have noticed that Carol Ryff's model, the PERMA model, the mental health continuum as proposed by Corey Keyes, all of this is kind of relevant to salutogenic theory. And also, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can kind of conceptualize all the different aspects of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as salutogenic resources. For example, what are Maslow's hierarchy of needs? At the bottom of this hierarchy, we have physiological needs, such as air, water, food, heat, clothes, shelter, sleep. All of these are kinds of generalized resistance resources. Safety needs, personal security, financial security, emotional security. These are all GRRs, generalized resistance resources. Freedom from family violence or childhood abuse. Love and social needs, the absence of loneliness, absence of neglect, family, friendship, intimacy, trust, acceptance. Again, GRRs. Esteem needs, I'm just working up the hierarchy here. A need for strength, competence, self-confidence, mastery, independence, freedom. GRRs. Cognitive needs, creativity, foresight, curiosity, meaning. These are GRRs. Aesthetic needs, appreciation of the world around you, appreciation of beauty, appreciation of aesthetics, and a sense of intimacy with nature. GRRs. Finally, self-actualization, utilizing and developing your talents and abilities and your ability to do that, having a loving partner, imparting knowledge in some way, being part of a whole. All of these can be conceptualized as GRRs. And transcendence needs, this top aspect of Maslow's hierarchy, the idea of finding self-transcendence. Self-transcendence could also be conceptualized as a GRR. The point is, there are lots of different models, lots of different theories for conceptualizing happiness. They all say broadly quite similar things, which leads us to this kind of ultimate question of how do we synthesize all of these models? How do we take the teachings of Seligman and Carol Ryff and positive psychology and Wong and Maslow and this and that and Buddhism, and how do we integrate all of these into this grand, unified formula for how do we achieve happiness. That is the subject of the next episode. Arguably, perhaps the most important episode because it talks about how happiness can be directly achieved. The idea of flourishing, how to achieve flourishing, how to actually achieve that high state on the mental health continuum, how to really have a good mental state, how to have subjective well-being, that is explored in the next episode. But I just think that this episode is important because to conceptualize happiness, we need to know what it is. We need to break it down, and we need to use that using up-to-date science based on real evidence, but also with a kind of backdrop of the philosophies and the humanities, and seeing where we can find intersections between the sciences and the humanities. For example, in the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, and indeed in flourishing. That's just an example. Because it's in that interlap that we're most likely to find the most accurate answers. That concludes today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed it and or found it useful. Have a lovely day.